Lisa had always enjoyed her walks around the neighborhood, especially after a long day at work. It was her time to unwind and clear her mind, the peaceful evening air giving her a break from the usual hustle and bustle of life. Her two loyal dogs, a German Shepherd and a Doberman, walked alongside her. They were more than pets, they were family. Lisa had raised them since they were puppies, and over the years, they had grown fiercely protective of her. That evening, the sun had just begun to dip below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the street. Lisa had just finished her shift at a local store and was looking forward to getting home. The grocery bags in her hands were a little heavy, but she didn't mind. The walk would give her a chance to stretch her legs and enjoy the calm surroundings. As she walked, she couldn't help but notice a police car parked near the entrance to her apartment complex. The officers were sitting inside the car, talking to each other in low voices. Lisa didn't think much of it at first. After all, this wasn't an unusual sight in her neighborhood. Police had been known to patrol the area, but it was usually quiet and they never seemed to make a big deal of anything. But as Lisa neared the car, one of the officers suddenly got out. He was tall, wearing sunglasses, and his uniform looked freshly pressed, the badge gleaming in the last light of the day. He stepped toward Lisa, his eyes scanning her up and down. The way he looked at her made her feel uncomfortable, but she tried to remain calm. She had dealt with police before, and she knew how to handle herself. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his tone cold and demanding. "What are you doing out here so late?" Lisa's first instinct was to simply answer him and keep moving, but there was something about his question that felt wrong. She paused for a moment, looking at him closely. His eyes didn't seem friendly. In fact, they looked suspicious, as though he was expecting her to give him a reason to act. "I'm just heading home," Lisa replied, her voice steady. "I live in the building right there." She pointed toward the apartments, trying to keep things casual. The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked over at the other officer, who had also gotten out of the car. This second officer was standing by the open door, arms crossed, observing Lisa with a neutral expression. Lisa didn't know what to make of it. She could feel the tension in the air, and her dogs had begun to notice it too. The German Shepherd, a big and strong animal, was walking slightly ahead, ears perked up and eyes focused on the officers. The Doberman, smaller but just as protective, was trotting close to Lisa's side, occasionally glancing back at the two officers. "Is there a problem?" Lisa asked, trying to keep the situation calm. The officer who had approached her didn't seem to appreciate her question. "It's not really a problem, but you're walking around this area at a late hour." "What are you doing here?" he repeated, his voice more forceful now. Lisa could tell this wasn't just a casual inquiry. There was an edge to his words, as if he was looking for a reason to stop her or accuse her of something. She took a deep breath, trying not to get irritated. "I've already told you I'm going home," she said again, standing firm. "I've lived here for years." The officer's gaze turned even more intense, like he was trying to read her every movement. Lisa felt a little uncomfortable, but she knew she couldn't back down. She had every right to be there, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. Just then, the German Shepherd let out a low growl. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. Her dog didn't usually react unless he felt something was wrong, and right now he was standing directly between her and the officer. His stance was protective, his eyes locked on the officer's every move. Lisa reached down to gently calm the dog, but she could feel her own anxiety rising. The Doberman was now standing close to her leg, his body tense and ready to spring into action if needed. The officer glanced down at the dogs, then back up at Lisa. "You need to control your animals," he said, his voice now tinged with annoyance. "They're fine," Lisa replied quickly, but she was starting to feel the tension grow. "They're just protecting me." The second officer, who had been silent until now, took a few steps closer, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the dogs. His expression remained impassive, but Lisa could sense the unease in his stance. The two dogs were clearly agitated, their instincts telling them that something wasn't right, and they were prepared to defend her if they needed to. Lisa took a step back, trying to create some space between the officers and her dogs. She wasn't sure what was going to happen next, but she knew she needed to stay calm. The last thing she wanted was for the situation to escalate further. "Are you planning to arrest me?" Lisa asked, her voice still steady but now tinged with a hint of frustration. She could feel the officer's eyes on her, and she hated the way they were looking at her, like she was some kind of criminal. The officer didn't answer her question right away. Instead, he glanced at his partner, who had now started to approach them, his hand resting near his holster. Lisa's heart began to race. She knew how dangerous things could get if they weren't careful. One wrong move and this could quickly spiral out of control. Her dogs, sensing her anxiety, began to bark louder, their growls growing deeper. For a moment, it felt like time stopped. Lisa, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, felt the weight of the situation closing in on her. Her dogs were on edge, ready to protect her if necessary, but she didn't want things to get violent. She could see the officers trying to decide what to do next, their eyes shifting nervously between her and the dogs. They didn't know how to handle this. Lisa was used to being a black woman in a world where people often assumed the worst of her. But her dogs, her loyal protectors, were now the ones making the officers hesitate. As the growling continued, the officers seemed to freeze, unsure of how to respond. Lisa kept her gaze steady, not backing down, but her mind was racing. Would they back off? Would the situation escalate? She didn't know, but in that moment she realized how much her dogs had become more than just pets. They were her guardians, and they weren't going to let anything happen to her without a fight. The officer's eyes flickered between Lisa and her dogs, his expression growing more tense by the second. He took a slow step forward, his hand resting closer to his belt, almost as if he was considering reaching for his weapon. Lisa didn't move, though her heart raced. She knew that the situation was spiraling quickly, and her dogs, sensing her unease, became more alert, their growls deepening. Her German Shepherd was the first to act, taking a few steps forward. The dog was big and strong, his protective instincts fully engaged. His hackles were raised and his eyes were locked on the officer. The Doberman, smaller but just as fierce, was standing even closer to Lisa, watching the situation with calculated focus. Lisa could feel her dog's tension in the way they stood beside her, their muscles taut, ready to act if necessary. The officer hesitated. He wasn't sure how to handle the situation. He had dealt with aggressive dogs before, but this wasn't just any dog. It was a well-trained protector, and Lisa was no ordinary woman. She could see the officer's nerves begin to show, and that's when the second officer, who had been watching silently until now, stepped in. "Hey," the second officer called out, his voice sharp and demanding. "Get those dogs under control before something happens." Lisa's eyes flicked over to him. She wasn't afraid, but she was feeling the weight of the situation. Her dogs were only acting out of instinct, but their actions could easily be misunderstood. She knew how quickly things could turn bad, especially with the officers on edge. "They're fine," she said, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "They're not aggressive unless they feel threatened." She glanced down at her dogs, who were now standing in front of her, still watching the officers closely. The German Shepherd, in particular, was keeping his eyes on the second officer, who seemed to be more cautious now, clearly aware that the dogs weren't backing down. "Control your dogs," the first officer repeated, his voice colder this time. He took another step toward Lisa, his hand still hovering near his belt. The Doberman growled low, and Lisa could feel the air around them thicken with tension. She was trying to stay calm, but everything in her body was telling her that this wasn't going to end easily. Lisa stepped forward, trying to put herself between the officers and her dogs. "You don't need to do this," she said, her voice firm but not angry. "I'm not a threat to you. I'm just trying to get home." The first officer didn't seem to care. His eyes were narrow, focused only on her. The dogs had him nervous, but there was also something about Lisa's calmness that seemed to frustrate him. He expected her to be scared, to back down, but she wasn't. She was standing her ground, and that made him uneasy. The power dynamic had shifted, and he wasn't sure how to regain control. The second officer moved forward, speaking to his partner in a low voice. Lisa couldn't hear what he was saying, but she could tell it was about her. She knew they were trying to decide what to do next, and she couldn't help but wonder if they were going to try something more aggressive. She was ready to defend herself, but she didn't want it to go that far. She wanted them to see that she wasn't a threat. The German Shepherd barked suddenly, snapping Lisa out of her thoughts. The bark was loud and forceful, like a warning. The officer stepped back instinctively, his hand now fully resting on his holster. The Doberman didn't bark, but his stance was just as threatening, his body coiled and ready. Lisa could see the hesitation in the officers' faces as they processed the situation. They hadn't expected this. They had expected an easy interaction, maybe a ticket, maybe a quick arrest, but not this. Lisa didn't move. She kept her eyes on the officers, watching for any sign of what they would do next. Her dogs stayed close, their posture protective but not aggressive unless provoked. She knew the moment she showed any weakness, the officers would seize the opportunity to make their move. She had to remain strong. She couldn't let them think they had the upper hand. "You can't just stop me because you feel like it," Lisa said, her voice still calm but assertive. "I'm not breaking any laws. I'm just trying to get home." The first officer's eyes flickered to his partner again. The second officer seemed to be reconsidering the situation, but the first officer wasn't backing down. He took another step closer to Lisa, his hand still near his belt. The dogs growled louder, a warning to the officer that he was too close. Lisa felt the shift in the air. The tension between her and the officers had reached a breaking point. Her dogs were picking up on her anxiety, and they were ready to protect her if necessary. She could see the first officer's finger twitching near his holster, and in that moment, she knew that things could escalate in the blink of an eye. But just as quickly as it had started, something strange happened. The first officer stopped moving. He froze. His eyes widened for a split second, and he seemed to hesitate. The second officer, who had been standing a few steps back, took a cautious step forward, glancing at his partner. Lisa didn't know what had caused the shift, but she felt it in the air. The officers were no longer advancing. For a moment, it seemed like the standoff was over, but Lisa didn't trust it. She didn't lower her guard, even though the officers had stopped their advance. She knew how quickly things could turn again. The dogs were still standing at the ready, their eyes never leaving the officers. They could feel Lisa's tension, and they weren't going to relax until she did. The first officer cleared his throat, still watching Lisa and her dogs. "Just keep the dogs under control," he muttered, clearly uncomfortable. He took a step back as though trying to distance himself from the situation. Lisa didn't know what had caused him to back off, but she wasn't about to relax just yet. The second officer, who had been more quiet throughout the exchange, seemed to be taking a different approach. He nodded slowly, then spoke in a more neutral tone. "It's late. Maybe you should head inside. We don't need any more issues." Lisa didn't respond immediately. She wanted to be sure they weren't planning anything else. But when she saw them start to move away, she knew it was time to go. She had to get home, and the officers had made it clear they weren't going to arrest her, at least not for now. She nodded slowly, her body still tense. "I'm going inside now," she said quietly, turning and starting to walk toward her apartment building. The dogs followed closely behind, still alert but no longer growling. As she walked away, she kept her eyes on the officers just in case. She didn't fully trust them, but at least for now, the situation seemed to be over. The officers got back in their car, still watching her from a distance. Lisa didn't turn around to look at them again. Her dogs were walking by her side, their heads held high as though they had just won a small but important victory. She felt a sense of relief flood over her as she reached the entrance to her building. The door clicked shut behind her, and she took a deep breath. She was home, safe for now. But she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just one moment in a much larger story. She had learned something that night, not just about her dogs and their loyalty, but about the way the world worked. And she wasn't sure if she would ever forget the feeling of standing her ground in the face of hostility, knowing that her dogs were ready to defend her no matter what. Lisa took a deep breath as the door of her apartment building clicked shut behind her. The tension she had felt only moments ago seemed to melt away as she leaned against the door, trying to steady her racing heart. Her dogs, sensing her relief, relaxed slightly, though their watchful eyes never fully left the hallway. They had been through a lot in the past few minutes, and she could tell they were still on edge, just like her. She made her way through the quiet hallway to her apartment, the soft click of her shoes against the floor, the only sound breaking the silence. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar scent of her home wrapped around her like a warm blanket. It wasn't much, a small, modest apartment, but it was hers. It was the one place where she could always find peace, away from the chaos of the outside world. Her dogs followed her inside, their tails wagging slightly now that they were back in familiar territory. Lisa smiled and patted each of them on the head. "You two did good," she whispered softly. She knew her dogs would never allow anyone to hurt her, but tonight had been different. The officers had been close, too close, and it had shaken her more than she cared to admit. She put the groceries down on the counter and began to unpack, her hands moving automatically as she tried to push the events of the evening to the back of her mind. But the images of the officers, of their hostile glares and their raised hands, kept replaying in her head. What had she done to deserve that kind of treatment? She was just walking home. She wasn't doing anything wrong. But to them, she had been a target, someone they could control, someone they could intimidate. Lisa glanced over at her dogs, who had settled down on the couch, their eyes still alert but no longer tense. She could feel the bond between them stronger than ever. They had always been there for her, through good times and bad. And tonight, in the face of that intimidation, they had done exactly what they were trained to do: protect her. But it wasn't just the dogs. Lisa realized that, in a way, she had stood up to the officers too. She had refused to back down, even when they tried to intimidate her. She had kept her composure, spoken calmly, and, most importantly, she had made it clear that she wasn't afraid. That was something she hadn't realized she was capable of doing until now. It was one thing to read about injustice. It was another thing entirely to experience it, and she had faced it head-on. As she continued to put away her groceries, Lisa's mind began to wander. She thought about the officers, their power, their confidence, their badges. But she also thought about the fear that had shown in their eyes when her dogs had stood in her defense. They hadn't expected that. They hadn't expected her to have any kind of power, any kind of control over the situation. They thought they could dominate her, but instead, it was her dogs who had made them hesitate. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. She glanced toward it, startled. She hadn't been expecting anyone. Her first thought was that it might be the police again, but the idea of them showing up at her door seemed unlikely. Still, she walked cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. To her surprise, it was her neighbor from down the hall. Lisa opened the door, trying to hide her surprise. "Hey, what's up?" she asked, giving her neighbor a small smile. Her neighbor, a middle-aged woman who lived alone, stood in the doorway looking a bit flustered. "Sorry to bother you," she said, her voice a little shaky. "I saw what happened outside. Are you okay?" Lisa blinked, taken aback. She hadn't expected anyone to notice. It had all happened so quickly. She had just wanted to get home and forget about it. But the way her neighbor was looking at her, concerned, almost protective, made Lisa realize how much more the incident had affected her than she had realized. "I'm fine," Lisa replied, trying to reassure her. "Just a little shaken up, that's all." Her neighbor gave her a look that said she didn't fully believe her, but she didn't press the issue. "You know," she said quietly, "I saw them pull up. I didn't know what was going on, but I didn't want to just stand by and do nothing. It didn't look right. I'm just glad you're okay." Lisa appreciated the gesture, but she didn't want to go into the details of what had happened. "Thanks," she said with a soft smile. "I appreciate you checking on me." For a moment there was a silence between them, one that felt a little heavy. Lisa wasn't used to people looking out for her like that, especially not in a world where it sometimes felt like she had to constantly watch her own back. But her neighbor's kindness reminded her that there were still good people in the world, people who cared. "I'm glad I could help," her neighbor said, taking a step back. "If you even need anything, don't hesitate to ask, okay?" Lisa nodded. "I will, thank you." The neighbor gave her a reassuring smile before walking back down the hallway. As the door closed, Lisa leaned against it, feeling the weight of the conversation settle into her chest. It had been a small thing, but it had meant a lot. In a way, it had been a reminder that despite the rough moments, there was still kindness in the world. There were still people who cared. She turned back to her apartment, the silence of the space now comforting. She had been through a lot, but she knew she had the strength to get through it. The night had been a reminder of the kind of world she lived in, one where people could be cruel, where power could be abused, but also one where the bonds of loyalty and courage could overcome even the darkest moments. Her dogs were curled up on the couch, their eyes half closed but still alert. Lisa walked over to them, kneeling down to pet each one. "You two are something else," she said softly. She could feel the warmth of their bodies, the steady rise and fall of their breathing. They had been there for her when she needed them most. And for the first time in a long while, Lisa felt truly thankful. She sat down beside them, leaning back against the couch, her mind still racing. But she was no longer filled with fear or anxiety. Instead, there was a sense of peace, of quiet strength that settled within her. No matter what the world threw her way, she knew she wasn't alone. She had her dogs, and she had her own courage. For the first time in what felt like ages, Lisa allowed herself to relax. She closed her eyes, listening to the gentle sound of her dog's breathing and the distant hum of the city outside. In that moment, she knew she had the strength to face whatever came next. The world could be a harsh place, but with her loyalty by her side, she could face anything. The days that followed the incident with the officers felt different. Lisa found herself looking over her shoulder more than usual, though she didn't know exactly why. Maybe it was the memory of how close the officers had come to arresting her without cause. Or maybe it was the sense that things weren't always as they seemed in her neighborhood. Whatever it was, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. At work, she tried her best to focus on her tasks, but her mind often wandered. The sight of the officers' cold eyes still lingered in her thoughts, and it was hard not to imagine what might have happened if her dogs hadn't intervened. Would they have arrested her? Would the situation have escalated further? Lisa didn't like to dwell on those kinds of thoughts, but they kept coming back. She couldn't help but wonder if she'd been a little too lucky, or if the officers had just been thrown off by her dogs. What if they had decided to press the issue? What if things had turned violent? But no matter how much she thought about it, Lisa couldn't change what had happened. She could only control how she moved forward. One evening after another long shift, Lisa made her way home as usual. The sun had set, and the street lights were just beginning to flicker on, casting a dim glow on the sidewalk. She was tired, but there was something comforting about the routine of walking home. The weight of the day slowly lifting with each step. As she approached her building, she saw a familiar figure standing near the entrance. It was her neighbor again, the woman who had checked on her after the incident with the officers. She was standing by the door looking out into the street. When she saw Lisa, she waved and walked over. "Hey, how's it going?" the neighbor asked, her voice warm. Lisa smiled, glad to see a friendly face. "Hey, I'm doing okay. Just another day at work." Her neighbor nodded, but there was something in her expression that seemed a little off. "You sure you're okay? I mean, after everything that happened the other night?" Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I'm fine. I guess I'm still processing everything. It's hard to shake the feeling that something could have gone wrong." The neighbor gave her a sympathetic look. "I understand. I mean, I can't even imagine what you went through. But you're here now, right? You're safe. That's what matters." Lisa nodded, appreciating the words of comfort. It was nice to hear someone else acknowledge how difficult the situation had been. She hadn't realized until now how much she needed someone to talk to. The weight of the encounter had been hard to carry alone. They stood there for a few moments, watching the street as the night settled in. Lisa's dogs, who had been by her side through everything, were at home waiting for her. They had been a constant source of support, but sometimes even the best companions couldn't replace human connection. "So, I was thinking," her neighbor said, breaking the silence. "Maybe we could grab coffee sometime. You know, just to talk or even just get out of the house." Lisa raised an eyebrow, surprised by the suggestion. She hadn't really thought about spending time with anyone other than her dogs lately. "I'd like that," she said after a moment, a small smile tugging at her lips. "That sounds nice," the neighbor smiled back. "Great. I'll let you know when I'm free." Lisa felt a sense of relief at the thought of getting out and doing something normal for once. It had been so easy to fall into a pattern of isolation, especially after what had happened with the officers. But maybe this was an opportunity to break free from that and connect with someone who understood the weight of the world, even if just a little. As the evening wore on, Lisa went inside and spent some time with her dogs. They had been her rock through everything, and she knew she could always count on them to make her feel better. They were calm now, curled up on the couch, but their eyes followed her every move. Lisa couldn't help but smile at them. They were always so aware of her, so attuned to her emotions. Later that night, as she sat on the couch with her dogs at her feet, Lisa found herself reflecting on the events of the past few days. It wasn't just the encounter with the police that had left her feeling uneasy. It was everything. The way people looked at her sometimes, the way she often had to guard herself, the way her race seemed to define how others saw her. It was exhausting, and it made her question whether things would ever be different. Would the world ever be a place where she didn't have to worry about the possibility of being stopped for no reason? She thought about the officers too. They had seen her as a target, someone to question and control, but the moment her dogs had stepped in, everything had changed. She had felt their fear, their hesitation. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about the power they had given to her through their loyalty and strength. She had been the one in control for once, and that realization had stayed with her, lingering in her mind even after the officers had left. Lisa stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the street below. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost too peaceful. It was hard to believe that something as violent and unjust as what had happened could take place in a place that seemed so calm on the surface. The thought that kept circling in her mind, however, was simple. She wasn't powerless. She had been treated like she was, but she wasn't. Not anymore. Her dogs had shown her that, but more importantly, she had shown herself that. She was stronger than she had known, and even though the world sometimes seemed like it would try to break her, she knew she wasn't alone in it. Her phone buzzed on the counter, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at it and saw a message from her neighbor. "Hey, I'm free tomorrow afternoon. Want to meet for coffee?" Lisa smiled as she typed a quick response. "Sure, I'd love that." It wasn't much, just a coffee date with a friendly neighbor, but in that moment, it felt like a step toward something bigger. It felt like a step toward normalcy, toward reclaiming the parts of her life that had been overshadowed by fear and uncertainty. Later that night, as Lisa lay in bed, she thought about how much had changed in the past week. She had faced a situation that could have turned violent, but it hadn't. She had faced down fear and come out stronger. And now, with a simple coffee meeting on the horizon, she felt a small flicker of hope that things could, in fact, get better. Maybe she couldn't change the world all at once, but she could take small steps toward creating the kind of life she wanted to live. One step at a time. She closed her eyes, the sound of her dog softly breathing beside her, and for the first time in a long while, Lisa felt at peace. The days after Lisa's coffee with her neighbor felt different. There was a calmness that settled over her like a fog lifting. She had spent so many days feeling like she was walking through life on edge, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the next bad moment. But now she was learning how to take each day as it came, to move through it without constantly looking over her shoulder. She couldn't deny that the encounter with the police had changed her. It had opened her eyes to a lot of things about the world, things she had already known but had never really allowed herself to fully understand. The world could be unfair, unjust, and sometimes downright cruel. But it didn't mean she had to accept it or shrink from it. She didn't have to let it define her. The more Lisa thought about it, the more she realized something important. The power she had in that moment, the ability to stand her ground, didn't come from anything external. It came from within her. Yes, her dogs had been there to protect her, but it was her confidence, her courage that had kept her standing tall. In the face of authority, in the face of fear, she had chosen to be strong. That thought stayed with her as the week passed. Each day she felt more confident, more grounded. The heaviness that had once weighed on her seemed to lift piece by piece until it was no longer there. She began to find joy in simple things again, the laughter of children playing outside, the quiet hum of the city at night, the warmth of her dogs beside her on the couch. And then, one evening as Lisa was walking home from work, she spotted a familiar face standing by the entrance of her building. It was her neighbor, holding a coffee cup and waiting for her. Lisa smiled, feeling a wave of warmth wash over her. "Hey, there you are," the neighbor greeted with a cheerful wave. "I was hoping we'd catch up." Lisa laughed softly. "I'm glad you reached out. I've been looking forward to this." They walked into the building together, exchanging small talk as they made their way to Lisa's apartment. As they sat down in the living room, Lisa's dogs trotted over, tail wagging in greeting. Lisa was used to their constant companionship, but seeing them with someone else made her realize just how much they meant to her. They weren't just pets, they were her family, her protectors, her friends. They had been there for her in ways she couldn't explain. "So, how have you been?" her neighbor asked as she sipped her coffee, looking around Lisa's apartment. "I know things have been a little heavy lately," Lisa nodded. "Yeah, they have been. But I'm starting to feel better, you know? I've had some time to think about everything, and I think I'm finally ready to move forward." Her neighbor smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that. You deserve to feel peace." They spent the next few hours talking, sharing stories about life, work, and everything in between. It was refreshing to talk to someone who genuinely listened, someone who didn't judge or make assumptions. For the first time in a long time, Lisa felt like she could just be herself, without the weight of the world pressing down on her. As the evening wore on, Lisa felt a sense of calm she hadn't known in a while. The incident with the officers, while still a part of her story, no longer had a hold on her. It was a chapter that she could close, not because it was forgotten, but because she had learned from it. She had learned to stand her ground, to find her own voice in a world that often tried to silence it. And then, just as they were about to say goodbye, her neighbor stood up and smiled. "I know this sounds silly, but do you want to take a walk with me? Just down the street?" Lisa felt a lightness in her chest at the invitation. "I'd love that." They stepped outside into the cool evening air, the stars shining above them as they walked down the quiet street. The city seemed different now, less threatening, more welcoming. Maybe it was the simple act of walking side by side with someone who cared. Or maybe it was the fact that Lisa was finally beginning to see the world as something more than a place to survive. But something about the night felt peaceful. As they walked, Lisa realized how much she had changed. She wasn't the same person who had stood frozen in front of the officers, afraid and unsure. She was stronger now, more self-assured, and the world didn't seem quite so scary anymore. The next few weeks passed in a blur of small moments. Morning walks with her dogs, long chats with her neighbor, and quiet evenings spent at home. Lisa found herself reconnecting with the things that brought her joy, things she had pushed aside for too long. She began to realize that, in her search for peace, she didn't need to change the world. She just needed to find her place in it, her own corner where she could breathe, be herself and feel safe. One afternoon, as she was walking her dogs in the park, she noticed something that made her pause. A small group of children were playing near the swings, laughing and running in circles. Lisa watched them for a moment, their carefree joy filling the air. She felt a tug at her heart. Her dogs, sensing her shift in focus, stopped beside her. The German shepherd nudged her with his nose as if to remind her that she wasn't alone. Lisa bent down to pet him, a smile spreading across her face. As she stood up, she realized something important. She didn't need to fear the future. She had come so far in such a short time, and the world, though it had its share of darkness, also held beauty. There were good people in it, like her neighbor, who cared, who reached out when they saw someone in need. And there were places, like this park, where she could just be, where she could let go of her worries and enjoy the simple things. Lisa felt the warmth of the sun on her face and the soft breeze rustling the leaves. She stood there for a few moments, taking it all in. This was her life now, and she was going to live it fully, without fear. Her dogs barked softly as if urging her to keep walking, to keep moving forward. Lisa laughed, feeling lighter than she had in months. She nodded and began to walk, her loyal companions at her side. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, she felt hopeful about what lay ahead. No matter what the future held, Lisa knew one thing for certain. She was ready to face it. With her dogs, her strength, and the lessons she had learned along the way, she was no longer afraid. She was ready to take on whatever came next, one step at a time.